Sorry for the delay, but I want to make sure everyone's muted before we begin. All right. All right. Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today, we are proud to host Nathan Robinson, a speaker in our War and Peace series. He is live from New Orleans, Louisiana today. Nathan Robinson is the editor of Current Affairs magazine and is a political columnist at The Guardian. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, The Nation, Al Jazeera America, Salon, and others. He has also appeared as a commentator on NPR and BBC Radio. He is the author or editor of 10 books, including Trump, Anatomy of a Monstrosity, great title, Why You Should Be a Socialist. His recent book, The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World, which was co-authored with Noam Chomsky, will be the subject of our interview today. Robinson holds a JD from Yale Law School and is presently a PhD student in sociology and social policy at Harvard. So welcome, Nathan. It's great to have you with us today.
It's so nice to be with you all.
Yeah, fun. So I'm going to begin the first question on something that I think probably a lot of people will be interested in knowing. You wrote that from reading Chomsky, you learned to question conventional wisdom
Hmm.
and to forensically analyze both government documents and the mainstream media.
Hmm.
And what I have noticed, even in our progressive circles, is that people tend not to question their trusted sources, whether
Hmm.
that's MSNBC, PBS, New York Times. So I want to know what your process is for evaluating the news you see and hear from these
Hmm.
sources, especially. What is your questioning method that we can learn from?
Hmm. Interesting. Well, so just to give a little context there first, I sort of came of age politically at the time of the Iraq War. I graduated high school in 2007, and I was exposed to Chomsky's writing when I was about 14, 15 years old. And that was at the time when the Bush administration was waging the war in Iraq. And that was a case in which, the presidential administration was giving a justification for a war that was very, very widely believed at the time. It was bipartisan. In fact, there was very little questioning of the basic justifications for the war in the mainstream media. And Chomsky came through. When you would open up one of Chomsky's books, you would find facts and background that you weren't seeing anywhere else. You would hear lots of things that were being left out of the description of the situation. So, I mean, Chomsky would, of course, first point to the fact that Iraq wasn't a serious threat to the United States. He would point to the fact, all of the ways in which the Bush administration was distorting the evidence. He would point to our long history of catastrophic violence in the Middle East. He would expose, the calamity of the Afghanistan war at a time when that was being described as the kind of good war. And he would even go back to the Gulf War, which was considered a kind of good war against Saddam Hussein, a response to aggression. And he would show that the situation was actually much more complicated, that opportunities for diplomatic resolution of the conflict had been ignored. And oftentimes he was doing that by just finding things that were in the newspaper, but not prominent in the newspaper. So even not by going to necessarily obscure sources, but a very careful kind of reading. So at the time when the Gulf War was being talked up as a noble and necessary response to aggression, I mean, he would find little quotes here and there that were suggesting like diplomatic overtures from the Iraqi government. And he would show that the United States was deliberately evading these potential opportunities for peace. And he's done that with many, many, many conflicts. And it's a method that just involves close reading and critical thinking. And in fact, one of the remarkable things that I've learned, I mean, when you look at this book, There's so many endnotes as is typical for a Chomsky book. I think it's 100,000 words plus 33,000 endnotes. So they're about a third the length of the actual text. But if you look at the endnotes, oftentimes they are to, the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Wall Street Journal. And so you often get a very different picture of the world if you just very, very carefully scrutinize even the same things that everyone else is reading.
Very, very good. I want to quote something from the book. They said, consumers of media should remember that their lack of knowledge is an important part of what allows the powerful to maintain their control. And I think we
Mm,
always have to be aware that we don't know the whole picture, and we always
mhm,
need to be questioning. And that's part of what you're talking about, I think. And I just
mhm,
want to hold up the book because this is an extraordinary book. The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. It's excellent, and I highly recommend it. And yeah, so I hope people will get that because it's really something we should be discussing. I meant to tell you, Nathan, this is a pick for our next book club, the Praxis Book
Oh,
Club.
nice. Oh,
Reading
how
this book.
wonderful.
Yes, so we will have more
It's
input.
not the most uplifting read.
It's not what?
It's not the most uplifting kind of a read.
No, but it's vital education.
Hmm.
It really
Hmm.
is. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, and the purpose of writing the book was that Chomsky has been, an analyst of foreign affairs and U.S. politics since, about 1965. He started writing publicly on these topics, and I've been a reader of his for a long time, and he became a subscriber to our magazine, and we struck up a correspondence, as many people have with Chomsky, and I approached him because I find his critiques so powerful, so mind expanding, so helpful in cultivating that ability to think critically that I really wanted to help him package his ideas and his analysis for a new generation that wouldn't necessarily have read what he was writing about the Vietnam War at the time or what he was writing about the Iraq War in 2003, because I think that even in our own time, when these events are kind of receding into the past, there is so much we desperately need right now for people to first off understand the history, but also understand that method that we're talking about of questioning dominant narratives.
Right. And staying with that for a moment, I want to go to the language of propaganda, which you talk about in the book too. And one thing I think that was really interesting about this book, because some of Chomsky's books are not as readable as this is.
Hmm.
And I think you've done a wonderful service with him in writing this book. So I want to commend you for that. I
Thanks.
actually
Yeah.
also interviewed his daughter, Aviva Chomsky.
Oh yeah, she's magnificent. She's a
Yeah.
fantastic, phenomenal scholar in her own right.
There's what?
She's a phenomenal scholar in her own right on, Central
Absolutely, she
America,
is.
on climate change.
Yeah, her
Um,
book on Is Science Enough is really excellent. So I want to talk about the language of propaganda because you talk about how the indefensible becomes possible with euphemisms. And
hmm,
some of those include bombing peasants becomes pacification. We saw that in
hmm,
the Vietnam War. Robbing their land is called transfer of population. We're
hmm,
seeing that in Gaza. Stability means support for U.S. interests. So I want to take that a step further and a place where there's been really not agreement among the progressive community, and that's with the Russia-Ukraine war. I want to get into that a little. I know Noam Chomsky and your opinions
hmm.
on this and how that war is framed in our media using some of the euphemisms that I mentioned. And one thing I never heard during the Biden administration, and maybe I wasn't seeing it, but I never really heard the word negotiation. It was like that became a bad word. So I want you to talk a little bit about the Russia-Ukraine war. What's left out in the media? What information do people not have?
There's a common sort of pattern of thought and speech that occurs in the context of most wars, where a few and you may have spoken to or read Norman Solomon, who does wonderful media analysis about how war is discussed in the media, and he has like all the principles that are the principles of war, and there are things like you must never try and understand the enemy's perspective. The enemy is the enemy. They are the aggressor, and any talk about, what might have motivated them to do what they did, is apologism for the enemy. That's a kind of common word. And apologism is a word that is used to describe analysis that doesn't actually take a side, that is just purely objective description of, well, this side in the war has these motivations, this side in the other. But in the context of war, if you were if you were to try and understand why Hamas does what it does, right, it would be seen as, humanizing and empathizing with and justifying and excusing Hamas's behavior. But the same was true if you go back to World War One. The effort to understand the context of World War One and describe it as anything other than pure German aggression was labeled unpatriotic, was labeled, siding with the enemy. And I think that, in fact, it's interesting because Chomsky, due to health reasons, he has been able to publicly speak for the last year and a half. But before that, at the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, he was giving a lot of commentary about it. And most of his commentary was a discussion of the background and the context to the war. And the fact that, Chomsky focused on what is, there's a wonderful new book called Hubris, The American Origins of the War in Ukraine by the diplomatic historian Jonathan Haslam, who goes through all of the ways in which, since the end of the Cold War, the United States was taking actions on the world stage that essentially antagonized or led to backlash in the Russian government. And they were kind of ignoring Russia's reaction and increasingly strong warnings from even US officials that Russia was likely to respond in a way that was violent. And Chomsky was pointing all of this out and saying, we need to understand that, the expansion of NATO was a real issue, and talking about it doesn't mean exonerating Putin for his aggression. And when people hear Chomsky's analysis, they often immediately think, no matter how many times he says, I'm not exonerating Putin for his aggression, just as in 2003, those of us who were saying, the United States is going to make Iraq worse off, not better off, were told that we were, siding with the dictator Saddam Hussein, undermining the war effort. If you opposed the invasion of Afghanistan, you were siding with Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. These are common rhetorical techniques in every war, and I think when we see that, we understand how certain really crucial issues for understanding any war, such as trying to understand why is the enemy doing what they're doing, they get taken off the table so that you can't even discuss the situation rationally.
Right. That's the unfortunate part. It's very hard to have a rational discussion about Russia, Ukraine. I've not had that problem with the war in Gaza, but definitely I've seen it with Russia, Ukraine because of what's left out of the narrative and the background. I wanted to ask you another, I guess, another how would I put this, meme of war, really, are the atrocity tales you refer to. And I've certainly, in fact, in one of our last discussions, this came up, an atrocity tale. Well, their side did this, but our side would never do this. And seems to be, as you pointed out, a core component of establishing the enemy as a new Hitler or a new enemy that is, there are terrorists, so you can't negotiate with terrorists. We have that slogan, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So the enemy then, their leader becomes a new Hitler, whether it's Saddam Hussein, Slobodan Milosevic, Assad, Putin, it doesn't matter who it is, they're always Hitler. So we see this is constantly part of the narrative. And if you have anything more you'd like to say about these atrocity tales, because I see how they're used to manipulate.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, again, it's just important to look over the course of history at how in every war there are accusations that are made against the enemy, that they take actions that are just so far beyond the pale of ordinary morality and even beyond the laws of war, that they are monsters and we cannot possibly negotiate with them, and all we can do is exterminate them. Now, importantly, many of the atrocities can be perfectly real, right? So Saddam Hussein had many crimes. He was, a horrific dictator. The Japanese during World War II committed many heinous crimes against prisoners of war and against occupied peoples around the world. And the Russians in Ukraine as well. And certainly Hamas, right? You don't need to exaggerate, but what happens is an exaggeration, a turning of things that are monstrous into because the truth is horrible. We lose the ability to distinguish between the truth and then this even more extreme, exaggerated version. And what's important to understand is the endless inflation of the threat of the enemy, right? So the enemy won't stop until they conquer everything. That's the way that Hamas is described. That's the way that Putin is described. Like they will not stop until they conquer everything. And so any attempt to negotiate with the enemy, because they are so monstrous, because they won't stop until they've conquered everything, becomes appeasement and becomes de facto a counsel to surrender to the enemy. And the same is true, again, going back to World War II, those who said that, obviously that atomic bombs shouldn't have been dropped. The idea is that, well, the Japanese were so, hell-bent on destruction that it was necessary. And you need to look, I spoke to an expert on dehumanization who was saying the first thing we need to do is we need to understand that our enemies are always human. That's a disturbing thing because it means that even the worst people are human, but they are always human beings, even when they do monstrous things. And that can be a very hard thing to say during wartime without provoking a major backlash.
Yes. And the problem that you point out in the book too of U.S. hegemony really all around the world. This is something I think that has disturbed a lot of us over many years as we see our country embroiled in one war after another. And it's been pretty much constant since the Korean War, or maybe since the Second World War.
Mm.
We have always been at war. Do you see any way out of this? I mean, with our Pentagon budget, our war budget, our military industrial complex, where would there be any kind of point where we could make some sort of difference to this scenario?
Well, yes. I mean, the book over the course of the chapters of the book, we go through many of these conflicts, and we paint a picture, as I mentioned, that's rather bleak of a series of endless wars, of the ceaseless creation, the manufacturing of new enemies, and there are many of those in power who, for ideological or economically self-interested reasons, are always pushing us towards new wars. But in the final chapter of the book, we do end on a kind of promising note, which is that we review the history of dissidents in the United States in particular, and as well as around the world, and show what dissent has and can accomplish. And the fact is that while war seems like a constant, most people don't want to go to war. War is horrendous, and most people have an instinctive aversion to war. Even soldiers don't want to go to war. They are ordered to war. And in fact, the number of people who have an interest in wars is actually quite small. The vast majority of us have an interest in avoiding war at almost all costs. And so the good news is that if you have true democracy around the world, you don't have war because people aren't interested in it. And so I do think that to the extent that our country and other countries become more democratic, peace is achievable. We have maintained quite a fragile peace, but we have maintained peace. It has existed. It can exist. Right now, there are potential future major wars that we warn about. For example, potential war with China, potential war with Russia. But we argue that these are, in fact, avoidable, and that whether they're going to be avoided depends on who is in power and depends on the rest of us to kind of seize and control the levers of power.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about China next, actually, because I worry about the rhetoric that has been making China the next enemy. It's like we have
Yeah.
a history of making Russia an enemy, which has never gone away. And also it's happening with China. And this is worrisome. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we have a chapter in the book on China, which is actually available for free online as an article in Current Affairs as well. And I think the article is called something like "If we want humanity to survive, we must cooperate with China." And the argument that we make here is that there's a lot of very militaristic, nationalistic, denunciatory rhetoric about China in foreign policy circles, in the political class. And we argue that this further inflames the situation because of a principle that's pretty well established in the literature on international relations called the security dilemma, which is where one country acts in a way that it thinks is defensive, but the other country interprets that as offensive. And so the other country reacts in a way that it means to be defensive, but is also then interpreted as being additionally further offense. And you can see that in the US relationship with China. For example, there was just news this morning or yesterday about supposedly Elon Musk being shown a secret US plan for war with China. Well, there's the issue of Elon Musk getting to see secret US war plans, but there's also the issue of the fact that if the United States is planning for a war with China, China is aware of this and sees that as aggression. They see it as the United States preparing for a war. And so the rational reaction on China's part is to prepare to go to war with the United States, to further arm, to expand their nuclear arsenal in order to counter the US, in order to counter what they perceive to be the US threat. And that's not to say that China isn't an aggressor within its own sphere, or that Taiwan doesn't have to fear Chinese aggression. What it is to say is that US actions provoke responses around the world that we then see as evidence for the aggression of others without noticing how our own actions are causing the very thing that we see as a threat. And that is a consistent thread across the stories, whether we're talking about Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, whether we're talking about even the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether we're talking about Palestinian acts of terror in Israel, the failure to see how our own actions are causing the backlash that we then see as proof that the world is full of enemies bent on destroying us, has been a constant of our history since World War II.
Yes, that's a very disturbing thing. I wanted to bring up an example of that you may or may not know about, but I know you know about the first part. But when NATO went from being a so-called defense military organization to one that actually starts a war or starts being quite aggressive, as they were in Libya and Belgrade and Serbia. And the interesting thing about the bombing of Belgrade and Serbia was, of course, that the reasons we were given is they were protecting or defending the Kosovar Albanians that were in Kosovo and the majority. But what they got for that, and this, of course, is never in the news, what ended up coming out of the NATO bombing of Serbia was, of course, being loved by the Kosovo Albanians to the point where US NATO created the largest military base in the Balkans in Kosovo. It's called Camp Bondsteel. It's on 954 acres. So these are the things that come out of some of our aggressions that are never talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
they're like a gift for being the going in it. But the other part of this,
Yeah.
and this is what I wanted you to comment on, was when we bombed Serbia, which is an ally of Russia,
Mm-hmm.
how would they see that? I mean, this
Yeah.
is
Well, yeah, no, that's a really important case to bring up. We talk about it in the book. One of the points that is made about the war in Ukraine is that obviously Ukraine is defending itself against Russia's aggression. We say that that's true. On the other hand, what is argued is that Russia could not possibly have anything to fear from the expansion of NATO, anything rational to fear from the expansion, because NATO is a purely defensive alliance, and if you, as long as you're not an aggressor, you have no reason to object to the expansion of NATO. And again, we need to look at our own behavior because in Russia, the bombing of Serbia in 1999 And the invasion and or the and deposing of Gaddafi in Libya in 2011 were seen as lawless acts by NATO, and indeed they were lawless because the 1999 bombing was done explicitly without a Security Council resolution, which is under international law necessary. In fact, the United States didn't argue that it was legal for them. They said it was a humanitarian intervention, that the necessity of it justified the fact that they hadn't obtained a proper Security Council resolution. So they acted in violation of the UN Charter. And in Libya, there was in fact a resolution, but Russia had explicitly been assured that the United States would not pursue regime change in Libya with its mandate, and then it did. And so these were seen as acts that proved that NATO couldn't be trusted. And again, you can make arguments for the legitimacy and the necessity of those actions. The point of raising them is to say that these drove counter reactions by the Russian state. That's the point.
Right. I wanted to have you tell us a little bit about the magazine that you're the editor of, Current
Oh,
Affairs.
sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So we're Current Affairs. We're based in New Orleans, Louisiana. We're in print 6 times a year. We are an independent nonprofit. We were founded in 2015. So yeah, we've made it to 52 print issues in a time when it's really difficult to keep a print magazine going. But we have a wonderful base of subscribers, people like yourselves, who read us, and we try and offer. We kind of, I was so inspired by Chomsky's model, and we kind of try and offer political analysis, foreign policy analysis, economic analysis through that kind of very critical, independent left perspective. We're nonpartisan, but we have clear values of equality and solidarity. We consider ourselves to be part of the left. We also, our print magazine has art, and it has satire and things, because we discuss lots of very heavy and often dark topics. We have a number of things in the print magazine to kind of lighten it up, because we believe that you should get to be cheerful, and you shouldn't just have to be depressed all the time by how awful so many things in the world are.
Great. You know what would be nice, Nathan, if you put the information in the chat box for how
Sure.
people could subscribe to the magazine.
Love to do that.
Yeah. And then tell us too, because it will be on the recording.
Yeah, so currentaffairs.org, and then currentaffairs.org/subscribe if you want to subscribe. And we have a podcast, we have a weekly newsletter, we have videos on YouTube. So there's lots, and we do books.
Great. All right. I want to open it up for questions from the audience now. If people want to ask Nathan a question, this would be the time to do it. When I call on you, you can unmute. And if I don't see you, I'll just keep asking my own questions. It's easier for me to see you if you use the automatic hand raising thing rather than putting your hand up like that. So some people came in late, so they may not be ready to ask things yet. But I'm interested in looking, while we're talking about this, the idea of not negotiating with, oh, I see one hand up, but I just want to ask this since I've started.
Yeah, sure.
Not negotiating with terrorists, that slogan, which has become very useful to people who want to rationalize why you can't negotiate with Putin, or why you can't negotiate with Hamas, or whatever our current enemy is. They use that slogan as a way of distancing from them as being human, as you said earlier. Any comment on that?
Yeah, let me give you one example that we discuss in the book. So in 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, the US was reeling from the attacks and bent on not just bringing the perpetrators, the living perpetrators, the organizers, to justice, but bent on revenge. And that was in basically, I think Bush, George W. Bush said at one point, I'm having trouble controlling my bloodlust. And so when we invaded Afghanistan, we go back to the invasion of Afghanistan, which is often talked about as a necessary invasion, right? Whatever you might say about Iraq, overthrowing the Taliban and pursuing bin Laden in Afghanistan was necessary. Well, in fact, if you look at the invasion in October, November, December 2001, the Taliban were offering to give up bin Laden. At first they made an offer that was an offer to release bin Laden to a third country if the United States would provide evidence of his guilt. And the response of the Bush administration was, we don't negotiate with terrorists.
Mhm.
And then after the United States started bombing Afghanistan and all sorts of Afghan human rights groups started objecting to the US indiscriminately bombing Afghanistan, the Taliban came back and said, okay, let's enter into talks for the turning over of bin Laden, who had been a nuisance to the Taliban for a long time. Now, in the US at that time, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden were talked about as basically one and the same. But there was an opportunity there to drive a wedge between them, and probably to have the Taliban turn over bin Laden, to put him on trial for masterminding 9/11, to find him guilty and send him to prison. The United States spurned that opportunity because the Bush administration said over and over and over, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And what happened as a result? Well, they didn't get the Taliban to turn over bin Laden. In fact, bin Laden then eluded them for many years. And they wrecked Afghanistan. They did successfully overthrow the Taliban. They installed a corrupt regime that never attained popular support and that eventually collapsed as soon as the United States stopped supporting it 20 years later. It was a true catastrophe. It really, in the short term, there were some improvements for the people of Afghanistan. In the long term, it has been a calamity for Afghanistan. And so we argue that that's where this we don't negotiate with terrorists, there are just evildoers and you have to wipe them out kind of attitude. That's where it gets you. It gets you to decisions that do not serve your own self-interest and certainly don't serve the interests of humanity more broadly.
Right. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to Ben. You want to ask your question? Unmute.
Yes, Nathan, I'm glad to hear you. I've read your magazine, and
Oh, thanks,
it's
Ben.
great. It's one of these ones where it's the value add of print, being able to have all these beautiful illustrations. I always think
Mm,
he must spend a fortune on graphic illustrators,
yeah.
but it's a very nice magazine. It's beautiful to look
Well, thank
at and
you.
hold. So it's a
Thank you, Ben.
tactile experience as well. But I was really glad to hear you bring up the issue about the apparently imperial policy now is inching toward the PRC being the next big enemy.
Hmm.
And I feel like those of us on the left have never really seen this, at least from my point of view. Someone like Chomsky might have seen it further ahead of time. Like, but we have plenty of lead time to affect U.S. policy on it. It feels like everyone that you talk to in the military or intelligence is like, oh, this is just a fact. Our next enemy is China because
Hmm.
of a kind of a Mammalian fear that there's something bigger than us or as our same size out there. So we've got to do something about it. And it's
Yeah.
so atavistic and primitive, except it'd be funny if it weren't dangerous. So do you think there's any way that we can start to derail this war train this earlier on before it materializes, before it becomes policy?
Yeah, I think that's really important because, as you mentioned, if you take the Iraq War, by the time the anti-war movement gets going, the invasion is happening, and here we have, as you say, years of kind of lead time where you see little hints, op-eds about the conflict in Ukraine will say, well, we have to find a resolution there because we have to turn to the next war, which is going to be with China. And if you look closely, you can pick these things up, these sort of these subtle, like, and sometimes not so subtle attempts to create the next enemy. And so, I mean, one of the things we're trying to do in our own little way is, I mean, I think training people to understand how enemies are created, to have a populace that is kind of inoculated because they through kind of exposure to the techniques, so they see the techniques of manipulation. This is what we're trying to do with this book by going through the historical examples and showing, excavating the yellow peril rhetoric from years past, showing how the Japanese were dehumanized, showing how even Vietnamese peasants were presented as some kind of existential threat to the United States of America, which in retrospect looks totally bizarre. China is a far more plausible threat to the United States of America because it is, in fact, a large nuclear power. It has nuclear weapons that could reach the United States. It is growing. It is becoming more powerful all the time. And I think figuring out what the questions are that can, Chomsky always asks, okay, they talk about the China threat. Tell me, what is the threat? What is the threat that China poses to the United States? And he points out that oftentimes China's threat to Taiwan, which is real, or China's threat to internal dissidents are used to create the China threat. But these aren't a threat to the United States. They're very bad. But if you're trying to make the case that China is a threat to the United States, you have to buttress it with something. You have to show that they're threatening the United States. But if you look at the rhetoric from the Chinese government, it's very different from the rhetoric from the US. The rhetoric from the Chinese government is, please stop all of this Cold War mentality. They say, please stop characterizing this as a Cold War between our countries. It's not. We need to mend these bridges. Now, you could argue that they're not sincere about that and they're not to be trusted or what have you. But that's what they're saying. They're saying, please don't, we don't want to go to war. We're not a threat to you. We're not trying to threaten you. And indeed, in order to counter that, you would have to show some evidence that it's not true, that China does threaten the United States. And what China really threatens, and you can usually see this in the people who make the argument if you look closely at what they're saying, it threatens U.S. power in the Pacific. That's the real threat.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a question? They're too flabbergasted to ask. Okay, Katie, did you have your hand up? You're mute, Katie.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thanks, Nathan. I love this thesis. It's something I think about a lot. I guess my question is, in a practical way, how do we change the narrative in our daily lives? Is there a real palpable next step for all of us, or for me, for all of us sitting here? And I'm going to use an example. In the world of animal rights, they try to change the word dog owner to dog guardian. And it's slow in coming, and it's not really coming along, but it exists as a concept. How do we, in our daily lives at least, start to weave some different story about the enemy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the work you're doing here at Praxis is really important, actually, which is starting to get people together to talk about these things, and starting discussion groups in your community to read books, getting people together, and importantly, recruiting people and having conversations with people who don't already agree. This is to me the most crucial thing. Because, and this is one of the things with our magazine, is we've tried to write in a way, I don't want to just be read by leftists. The whole point of the way that we wrote this book was to make this critique accessible to people who hadn't necessarily encountered it before, hadn't thought about it, and wouldn't usually make it through a Chomsky book, which is very dense. So I think that the crucial starting point is to think, how do we expand the circle of people who are thinking the way we are, right? We have a kind of core group of really thoughtful, informed, committed people who want to avoid catastrophic wars in the future, who understand why peace is such an important cause, right? Who fear for the future of humanity and who care about their fellow human beings. So what do? And the first thing they have to do is think about, how do we build the circle of people who think like us? And that requires difficult conversations. That requires thinking about how you can educate people, handing them books, inviting them to talks, sending them YouTube videos, getting people together just to talk about things, to critically read the newspaper, to, watch a Norman Solomon video together, or there's a wonderful channel on YouTube called the Noam Chomsky Video Archive that now has he posts He's the most committed Chomsky archivist in the world. And so there are thousands of Chomsky lectures from across 50 years that are all available now on YouTube. So the question is, how do we spread the knowledge, spread the material? And there are lots and lots of different ways to do that. I did the way that I knew how, which was to start a little publication and try to get people to subscribe, and then to start writing books, and then to do talks. But I think you're doing great work here.
Well, and that's why two of the things that we have coming up on April 4th and May 6th are meetings with people these are free meetings where we're going to discuss propaganda, mythologies, how we get pulled in, and how we can learn to resist. And as you mentioned, how we inoculate ourselves. And I think one of those ways is by never losing the ability to question our sources and to question what we're being told. You have a chapter on on how mythologies are manufactured. And I think this is a really important thing to understand, that these stories that we've kind of grown up with, or at least become more politically conscious, have really invaded our space to the point where we may not know what we think. So I don't know if there are other questions, but you have any comment on that, on these mythologies and how they take hold?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of the book is called The Myth of American Idealism. And, one of the central points that Chomsky has made in his work since the 1960s is not just that the US pursuit of hegemony and power around the world has required horrific acts of violence, but about the way that the violence is not only ignored, but justified, massaged, or cloaked under rhetoric and stories that allow us to feel as if we are always the good guys in any story, and allow us to evade the kind of crucial self-scrutiny that is necessary for actually understanding what these historical events really were. So, for example, and he points out that even anti-war people can be susceptible to this kind of thinking. So even criticism of the Iraq War, we point out, was often criticism of it as a mistake rather than aggression, right? So we meant well, but we just made some mistakes. And Chomsky compares this to if a Soviet critic was describing the infamous Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a mistake rather than aggression. Well, we made some mistake. But there was nothing wrong with the underlying invasion. And the same is true of Vietnam. Oftentimes, Vietnam, we compile a lot of the rhetoric of it as a kind of tragic mistake. But Chomsky says we're better off seeing it as aggression, as a situation in which we were not the side that had right on our side. We didn't have right on our side, but then we were just fallible. In fact, U.S. leaders were basically pursuing indefensible ends. And that's something that really doesn't get aired very much. The idea that, there's this kind of presumption, and we document so many examples of it, that our ends, our goals are always good, even if our means are flawed. And Chomsky says we need to question even that assumption and understand that oftentimes even the ends aren't justified.
Right. Another point is that when we look at the enemies that we create and then juxtapose it with the number of military bases we have around the world compared to other countries, we have almost 800, and I don't think there's any other country that is even close to that. I remember looking up Russia, and I think they have somewhere between 12 and 20 bases outside of Russia. It's like, who is really the worrisome country here? And we never get that perspective in our news, which brings me to one other thing I wanted to ask you, and that is self-censorship in the news. Writers, reporters, like with the New York Times, with different mainstream news and television, how they self-censor themselves so they don't lose their jobs, and why this has become such a problem.
Well, it's interesting because I think Chomsky actually disagrees on self-censorship, and for kind of a funny reason. There's a wonderful clip of him talking to a BBC interviewer, Andrew Marr, about manufacturing consent. And the interviewer says, your argument is that we in the corporate media self-censor. We know the truth, but we conceal it. And Chomsky said, I don't believe you self-censor. I think you believe everything you say. What my argument is that if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting. You wouldn't hold the position that you hold. That is to say that by the time you get the position at the New York Times, you're not the sort of person who is going to push the boundaries. I actually experienced this. I had a crazy kind of direct experience with manufacturing consent because I was a columnist for The Guardian, which is a fairly liberal newspaper, and I had one tweet on Twitter that was critical of U.S. military aid to Israel, and I immediately this was written up in the news when it happened in 2021. I got an email from the editor-in-chief of The Guardian who said, "This you need to take this tweet down." And he implied that it was anti-Semitic, which it wasn't. You can read the news story. And it was very strange because the editor-in-chief of the paper had never communicated with me before. The subject line of the email was private and confidential. You don't tell anyone that we're telling you have to take. Now I took the tweet down, and then they fired me. They even removing the tweet. And it was kind of shocking to me. But the example was I hadn't, self-censored. I had transgressed the boundary, and so I was not the kind of person who could stay there. And the kind of person who could stay there is the kind of person. Now, maybe there are people who saw me and so, oh well, I better not make that kind of tweet. So there might be people who self-censor in that way. But also the Guardian is just apparently, and it's strange because the Guardian does produce a lot of critical and good work on the Israel-Palestine conflict. But I take it within a very sort of narrow band, and you don't step out of line.
So you don't write for The Guardian anymore now?
Sadly, I don't. I did write for The Guardian.
That's very interesting. One of our other guests had said that The Guardian was just a shadow of what it once had been.
Hmm.
So I think Ben wants to ask something else.
Well, I just would like Nathan to amplify a little bit more on what I see as a breakdown in the system, the network of communications. All of the mainstream media sources have lost their authority and prestige.
Yeah.
And part of it, in other words, I think this is sort of everyone's ontological dilemma. Who are the authoritative and definitive sources? And we have reached the point where there's no agreement on that.
Yeah, it's very concerning. I mean, I think about it all the time because on the one hand, it's good for people not to trust what they read in the New York Times. On the other hand, if that means they're turning to Joe Rogan's podcast, because and those who present themselves as offering, the real facts, all the experts are lying to you, we're offering the real facts. Oftentimes, those types of people are offering you even more low quality, poorly researched conspiratorial thinking than you would have gotten from just reading the mainstream media. I trust what I read in the New York Times far more than I trust what I hear on Joe Rogan's podcast. But what we need now is to have. I bang this drum all the time to build media institutions that are responsible, that are careful, that do not do faux objectivity that people can see through, because I think that creates distrust. But that are trusted by a wide swath of readers and viewers. I mean, that's kind of my life's project, is to try and work on building that, because as you point out, it's so crucial, because if you don't have, in a democracy where people are voting and their vote actually does, make a little bit of a difference. We can argue how much it does, but, people do pick their government, and they have the, people did, millions upon millions of people did vote for the Trump administration, in part because Donald Trump presented himself as anti-war, and he's not really anti-war. He's not going to rein in the military-industrial complex. But they listened to him, and they didn't trust the people who criticize him. They didn't trust the media that criticizes Trump. So there's no one kind of helping them see the world as it really is. And so we need to build institutions that people believe in and that will turn to when they want to find out how things really are.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Wanted to just get your opinion on the fact that some of our major, not the New York Times, but the Washington Post, um, and the television stations that are owned by conglomerates or just are so concentrated in their ownership with all the same point of view that it is really hard to get any analysis in publications where there's such a strong point of view.
Well, it's true, and we've seen that just recently, Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, it's a billionaire-owned newspaper, and he said explicitly, he just gave a directive, which was, I want the op-ed page of this newspaper to endorse free market positions.
Right.
And if you don't agree with me, well, I'm the owner of the paper, and you need to leave. And so several people did leave from the op-ed page. And it's incredible. I mean, he's just blatant about the fact that he says, well, I'm a billionaire. I bought the paper. Now I control what the paper says. And, it's very hard to build an alternative to the Washington Post. They are a long established and very well-resourced publication. I mean, the good news here is that it's easier than ever to start an independent publication. It would have been very hard to do what we did with Current Affairs back in 1992 because you wouldn't have been able to publicize what you were doing very easily. If you want to start a magazine, how are you going to find subscribers? Well, you don't have social media. You could send out a mailer to you go buy a lot of you have to print a lot of letters, a lot of free copies, and send them out. It was very, very difficult to build an independent publication. Whereas now, we found it very easy. We started this publication with $16,000 from a crowdfunding campaign, from a crowdfunding platform that brought in strangers that I didn't know. And so that was because there are crowdfunding publications, and people will donate, and so. There are things that are kind of exciting, in their potential for building new media institutions.
Now, at Current Affairs, do you have any foundation grants, or how dependent are you?
We got our first one recently. We turned 501c3 in the last year, and we got a grant from the Craigslist Foundation to write about animal welfare. We're now actually looking for other sources of grants. So if anyone has any leads, let us know, because we want to do a lot more work. We're expanding our animal welfare and animal rights coverage because they gave us this grant for this topic specifically.
Great. And you do, and subscribers is probably, you don't do advertising.
No. So our business model is not very lucrative because we don't have paywalls, which are a major way that publications make money. Is they blockade all of the good stuff, which we don't like because that means that only the people who already kind of like your stuff are going to get to read it, and we think the information is important. I think just is a good point. So we don't have paywalls and we don't have ads. So we are entirely subscriptions and small donations. Funding it.
Great. Well, you put your information about subscribing in the chat,
put that in there,
which I've saved.
Please consider it.
And everyone else can save. And it will be on the recording as well. And I want to hold up the book again because it's really important. The Myth of American Idealism. I highly recommend it. We are reading it in the Praxis Book Club, and we'll have more to say about it when we're finished.
Thanks, Ben.
So thank you so much, Nathan, for being with us today. You'll get a link to the recording tonight.
Wonderful. It was really nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for listening and coming along. And as I say, the work you're doing here is really, really crucial.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be in touch, Nathan. I really appreciate it.
All the best.
All right. Bye.
That was really good, Georgia. He was really somebody.
I have just a practical